Hello everyone and welcome back to Sage's Tabletop Table Talks. I'm Sage and I'm going to talk to you about tabletop role-playing games. Not my war fan, by the way. I love that sound. But anyway, this has nothing to do with anything. It's really cool. I dug it out of the closet. I think it's kind of cool. But okay. I am going to talk to you today, and it's an interesting topic. It's probably gonna be a shorter episode because it's one that I don't necessarily have like a whole lot of solid answers on. It's kind of one I have been kind of kicking around my head. I saw some creators talk about um lands and things like that. Specifically, Richard the Wandering DM was talking about rivers and world building. And while world building isn't necessarily my thing, I could talk about it maybe, but it's not really my thing as much as mechanical ideas are. But if you want to hear me talk about some ideas for world building, I could absolutely do that. But I was thinking with that about terrain and how terrain affects game mechanics. Um, so obviously, generally speaking, in many role-playing games, there's a lot of when there's overland travel. Um, there's a lot of times very complicated and very boring rules about it. Things like every day roll a survival check to see what if you guys get enough food or water or things like that. And even worse, rolling random encounter charts, which is the one of the most boring things you can do as a DM. If you're preparing the night, if you want to roll ahead of time, you can. If you choose to do that, I would suggest trying to figure out a way to incorporate what the random encounter is into like the night's mission. Obviously, combat encounters are a lot of times um, cats. Obviously, one of the things is combat encounters are a lot of times you kind of often dumb things like wolves and bandits and things like that that more or less can just be dispatched, which a lot of times, honestly, isn't that fun. Dispatching wolves or bandits for no real purpose isn't fun. One of the other issues you get into if you're doing more than just, say, combat encounters, like the players encounter a small shrine on their way to where they're going. As a player, I'm instinctually going to examine every bit of that shrine I can. I'm going to want to do religion checks to try to find out who that shrine is for, and detect magic to see if there's any magic on it. And I'm gonna poke and prod with that everything I can. Oh, okay. Lij represent. But I am going to do everything I can to examine that shrine. And if it's just a bit of flavor, well, I've just wasted like 10 minutes poking at, a decor rather than the plot. And it's very unsatisfying to me to do something like that. Other players may weigh in, but most games I've played in have felt the same. That's just kind of disappointing to see something and to be like, "Ooh, this is interesting. What is it?" Oh, it's a paperweight. Effectively, it's the gaming equivalent of a paperweight, or a picture of a baby you've never met, but you thought the painting looked nice. You know who you are, and I'm calling you out. But like, so it feel I felt like I just wasted 5 minutes. Um, But like I said, generally, there's a lot of hand waving involved. And anything very more modern to futuristic, considering once you get to a certain point in futuristic, we go back, but within a certain point, like a cyberpunkish kind of game or a modernish kind of game, even something as modern as like the 1920s, there isn't a whole lot of wilderness exploration left to be done. So traveling even from LA to Seattle, even if that takes a while to do, it's not like you're randomly encountering, dragons and bears and things like that, or even things like, I mean, like, realistically, and be honest, people, as cool as it might sound, how often have you been driving on a long road trip and had an encounter with a bandit or a biker gang or anything of that nature? And it might be cinematic to do so, which obviously cinematic is a huge thing to consider when we are talking about travel and things. But once again, if it doesn't really add anything to the plot, it it doesn't really do much. Unless, of course, you've had a huge stretch of roleplay and exploration elements to your game, and that you just need, you want to combat because you need to do something to kind of punch it up a little bit, get the players' bloods flow. You could obviously incorporate that into the plot, maybe, or maybe the players just need a couple thugs to rough up on for a couple of minutes in order to build this kind of fun fight, or even to make them feel kind of cool and powerful. I was running a Mutants and Masterminds campaign, and the players got kind of powerful, and they ended up being fairly powerful. I had a group of people who were like anime otaku, furry, kind of just like keyboard warriors go into a place and try hacking everything, and they were all just very like, ooh woo woo, we're gonna take over now. And they were just there so the players could just walk over and kind of push them over, because they weren't super powered. They were just kind of there as a comic relief fight. But I'm kind of getting off topic, like I often do. I mean, I had to talk about my shirt, my LIJ shirt. But yeah, so like random encounters during travel, and like I said, being on the road and having to roll survival checks in order to get from town A to town B often is very boring. It is often very just, uninspired. Like, and if you fail, what? You just punish the players for having a poor roll, for having a low survival skill. So now they get punished for it, and it's just unfun. But now obviously there's exceptions to that rule. If your game is meant to be a survivalist game, like let's say you're playing a game themed heavily on something like Fallout, where things like finding unirradiated water and medicine and food is part of the element, is part of the survivalist nature of the game, then yes, then it might be something a little different, and it's also something you've got to make sure the players are on board with, which is just a general rule anyway. But yeah, always make sure your players are on board if you're going to do these mechanics that are generally considered less fun. But the other thing, and kind of what's more interesting to me, is terrain in combat. So I'm of two minds. Generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of the tactical map with the square 5 foot to 1 inch to 5 foot square grids or hex grids or something of that nature. I find that less fun than doing theater of the mind, because the idea I can move 5 spaces forward and then roll an attack is less interesting than, aha, that enemy over there, I'll swing on a chandelier and drop kick him. But I see where its advantages lie. One of the things you can do with terrain is add interactive elements of the world to play with. You can have a body of water here, in this area, and then, thick trees that are almost impossible to pass through here, or, you have an alleyway where you're thin and you can't, 2x2, 10 foot wide, so you really can't flanking and that kind of maneuvering would be much more difficult, or things of that nature, and it can create kind of a fun tactical scenario if done right and not done all the time, and also done in a way the players can interact with the terrain without constantly being hindered by it. If you've got whole bunches of, difficult terrain, damaging terrain, lava and acid and spikes and pitfalls, and none of your players are really geared out for that kind of thing, rather the enemies just keep pushing them into these hazards, and it can feel very unfun for the player to do so, because it's like, oh, and it's like, well, maybe they should be decked out for that kind of things. And yeah, maybe, but that's not necessarily true, because maybe the players don't want to. Not necessarily don't want to think tactically, don't want to use the environment, but don't want to use the environment in the exact way that you have it set up to use. It can lead to a very difficult player scenario. Obviously, if the players can use your negative or your space to their tactical advantage, creating bottlenecks for large groups of enemies, or having a environmental element that exists as a weakness, like maybe they're fighting a vampire and there's holes in the ceiling and certain squares have patches of sunlight. Now, players can pass through that without a problem, but their enemy vampire can't, and it creates this thing where the players can use these patches of sunlight to tactically move to ways that the vampire would be difficult to, if not just pushing him through it. And if you allow, you could let your players do smart things like maybe your warlock uses his Eldritch Blast to punch holes in the ceiling himself, making this difficult terrain wider and wider and wider. Now, sometimes you do want things that are just bad for the players, like let's say there's poison on the floor and the enemy's immune to poison. You would have to use this as a way to take a weaker enemy and elevate them to the player's level, not too far above the player's level, because that leads to bad game experiences. But where the players might have difficulty, maybe the players see an enemy and they think that this is going to be an easy fight, and then realize that the terrain is against them. And you don't want to use this trick often. A couple of times in your campaign is enough. But if you use this trick over and over again, once again, as DM, it feels like you're cheating your players as opposed to giving them an engaging story. And as with all DM advice, your mileage may vary. But one of the things I don't like about that kind of thing is this idea of having to look and say, well, I can move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then if you move 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll be flanking the target, and the rogue getting, you as the rogue get your advantage and your backstab, and it can create a very route and routine in your fights. Because, like, in Dungeons and Dragons as is, terrain, or that kind of thing, it's a lot of it is just get the rogue flanking. And then against Dungeons and Dragons, you game like Mech Warrior, and when you have games that are a little more tactical, like say a Mech Warrior, that kind of spacing is important, because my light mech might be able to move in and out of a range with his superior speed, and maybe give him an extremely long range weapon, and that's how he can tactically do some damage to something like a assault mech, like an Atlas, or that's the only assault mech that comes to mind. I'm not as knowledgeable in MechWarrior lore as, say, Josh is, and maybe Josh can hop on this video and give us a couple of examples of assault mechs. I know a couple of light mechs are like the Locust and the Wasp, which are two of my favorites. But anyway, yeah. But Fate has kind of an interesting thing where Danger Patrol does something similar too, but Fate will have this mechanic wherein you will place a, they suggest index cards. I prefer a dry erase board, less waste, quick. You can quickly kind of put something on the field and then give it a quick erase, and then you can replace it with something else if need be. Markers are up here, and I'm not going to dig any of them out. But it kind of and then players can kind of just look and see what's available. And this kind of allows the players a little more freedom with how they interact with the environment. Both players, PCs, and the DM. Like Danger Patrol have everything on the field is the players or a danger. And some dangers are environmental, like maybe, say, a force field around a major enemy, and you have to hit your way past, because how Danger with their hits, you have to hit your way past the force field. One of the problems there is that players can just do really kind of weird stuff, like just shoot the force field till it goes away, which in some cases could make sense, like you're just overtaxing it to the point it breaks, but it also leads to this point where players just kind of use their high stats to pass an obstacle instead of being a little more creative with it. But one of the problems there, and also one of the problems is, while it allows you to make kind of interestingly interact the environment, it also kind of can create this push and pull where a player can be like, I want to push the vampire into the sunlight, and now the player and DM kind of have to come to some kind of agreement or argument about if that vampire was close enough to the sunlight beaming down for them to do such a thing, or, if an enemy's like, I am going to try to push you into the lava pool, where there's not a grid where you see exactly where you are, a player would argue, my character wouldn't, my character is a bowman. Why would they have any reason to approach that lava pool when they can stand far away from it and pick a target off at range? So there's pros and cons to both. I personally am willing to give up a little bit of that. I'm willing to give a little bit of that push-pull in order to allow a lot more wild creativity on how you want to interact with these environmental forces. But I do absolutely see the advantage of tactical elements of, things like, hey, and I think when you incorporate a lot more modern weapons, it kind of tactical locations become a little more imperative, because you have things like suppressing fire and cover, because in a more fantastic setting, players are wrap themselves in their cover, in armor, in shields, in parrying. Not very easy to parry a shotgun shell, so taking cover behind static objects, and even taking something like bulletproof vests that stop bullets. Yeah, once a bulletproof vest will stop a bullet, and then the ceramic in it breaks, and then it becomes far less useful. And also, if you're wearing a bulletproof vest and somebody shoots you, you end up with like 40 broken ribs. Now, obviously, once again, cinematic rules could take into effect here and be like, yeah, but how often in movies does a character get shot and just pull their vest open and obvious. So, once again, depends on what you're doing. But I'm kind of saying that a lot more modern more modern, some grittier, grittier elements to these games. Tactics, cover, and terrain, and flanking, and suppressing fire all have a lot more use and importance than they do in kind of a fantasy combat. Not that fantasy combat doesn't have that stuff. Obviously, if you're dueling somebody in the forest and you have more lighter movement and you can kind of shift and move and the terrain better, then that is something you can use on your opponent. Being able to push your opponent against water or walls is once again another tactical thing that you can do while you're doing kind of melee combat. It feels like melee combat or more medieval combat can feel more natural to be fluid. But once again, you can still have sci-fi. Danger Patrol. Danger Patrol is a perfect example of a science fiction game that uses very loose, very fluid, very pulpy combat mechanics. So, and I guess really what it comes down to is realism versus pulp. Are you going for something a little more gritty or a little more pulpy? Pulpy games or swashbucklery, things like that. Arrow flinting is a lot more tolerated in something pulpy than something gritty and realistic. But just from a mechanical standpoint, I do think both kind of have their advantages. Both have their problems, and it really just kind of comes down to, do you want players to see this field as spaces to move in order to get advantages on targets, where they are and what's against them? Or do you want the environment to almost play like a character itself, where it plays out like, the vampire example? The sunlight is something players can do maybe at a risk. Like, a player can try to push the vampire into sunlight, but in doing so, he has purposely put himself within the vampire's grasp, and on the vampire's turn, let's say the player fails his attempt to push the vampire into sunlight, the vampire now has him almost in a clutch and can immediately move on to the bite and the blood drain element that the vampire has. So it could easily be something wherein you're kind of trying to where it is something where it's like almost a tool itself. Like, yes, you can, but if you fail. But anyway, that's really all I have on this topic. It's just kind of a fascinating topic, and I've seen a few other D&D creators talk about it, but I decided I kind of want to weigh my own 2 cents in, because I think there's a lot here to kind of consider, a lot here to talk about, and a lot here to think about, both as game designers and as potential dungeon masters, and how you would like to handle things like difficult terrain and even things like overland travel. Do you want to hand wave overland travel, or do you want the players to kind of push through it? And a lot of it does just depend on genre and setting. But anyway, that's really all I have to say. Like, I literally have like a bag filled with like topic ideas, and as I think of them, I throw them in the bag, and I've been pulling them out at random because I'm a huge worshiper of the RNG gods. But anyway, I'm Sage, Ian, Sage, either one. I generally go by more Sage now these days, but Josh has known me before that, so that's why he calls me Ian in his videos. But anyway, I'm Sage, and I will see you next time. Bye.